Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Eggen, the Director of Patient Engagement and Clinical Programs with the RUNX1 Research Program. And today I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Patient Data Hub. I'll get into what it is, why we created it, and what we're learning so far since we launched it just under a year ago. And I hope you learn a few things today. If you're a patient, perhaps you're learning what are other patient experiences, and that'll give you time to sort of reflect on where you stand relative to other patients, what's different, what's similar, help you think about like what questions do you have about our patient community and what questions do you have about the Data Hub, and what do you think we should ask next that we're not currently asking about. I'm not going to be able to present an exhaustive set of charts about everything we're learning. Happy to answer any questions about what we are learning if you want to reach out to me after this presentation. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? And where do we go from here? So to date, we have connected with some lovely, kind patients who agreed to have their images shared in various formats. So I've connected to date with 350 patients across 202 families. And in many ways, I've connected with them, whether it's a one-on-one call through Zoom, phone, or informal discussions on Zoom, or in person at our patient conference last year. And almost every time I meet with a patient, they ask me or ask one another, is this a common experience? I have really flexible joints, or I have painful joints, really bad eczema or skin boils, or, I'm concerned about blood cancer. How common is it? And how common do stem cell transplants turn out to be no problem for our patient community? But unfortunately, even though I get to hear stories from patients one-on-one, before the Data Hub and before this last round of data analysis, frankly, I haven't been able to confidently or systematically answer those questions. And so I've begun. So you'll see today I'm going to present with you to you some findings so far from the Data Hub that can help answer these kinds of questions. And I continually add to this list of questions from conversations with you and other patients. And so please do continue to jot down those questions and send them my way. We'd love to ensure that we're really understanding the patient experience really well. Another goal of the Data Hub, though, is truly to help with discovery and scientific advancement. So it's really important that we understand our disease better, and we can help scientists know where to sort of dig deeper when patients report issues that they're struggling with. Scientists do come to us to ask, how many patients have between 100 and 150,000 platelets per microliter of blood, because I have an idea for a treatment, something that's looking good in the lab that I'd like to test, but I'm only going to be able to see if it's effective for patients in this range. Do you have enough patients who would be interested in participating in such a study and who would qualify? And we can't answer that question, or we couldn't answer that question as of a year ago. We're starting to be able to answer that question now. We'll get into bleeding later, but some scientists are also looking at, okay, I'd like to help show that we could intervene and prevent cancer, but we can't really measure cancer risk accurately. We can't measure a change in cancer risk, or we can't really measure, it would take a whole person's lifetime to measure whether or not they progress to blood cancer to show that my drug stopped them is nearly impossible. So they might need to look at other endpoints like reduction in heavy bleeding, or that sort of thing. And so this Data Hub is helping us look at, what does bleeding look like for patients? Is this something that we should focus on, or we should support scientists in focusing on, or is there something else that scientists should be looking at and thinking about measuring as they develop treatments? So backing up, what is the RUNX1 Patient Data Hub? So it's an online system that patients anywhere in the world can participate in. All they need are an electronic version of their genetic test report, or a letter from their physician indicating what their RUNX1 variant is, and so that we can confirm that they qualify for the study. And then, just some way to answer online questions about their health experiences. So that's what the Patient Data Hub asks. And then where does the data go from the Data Hub? So there are sort of two primary directions. One is toward helping, giving back to patients, learning from patients directly, what are they experiencing, and then giving back those results to them, like in this format right now, so that we can talk through, how does that resonate with you? And can you help me make sense of these data? Can you help me make sense of your experiences in a way that it puts all the puzzle pieces about RUNX1 FPD together? And again, this is a two-way street because we do share data back, and then we want to hear from you. What are you thinking, and what's missing, so that we can ask other questions that are important to you and to understanding the disease fully. And so that's a two-way street. In the other direction, like I mentioned, we need to share aggregated and confidential anonymized findings with scientists so that they know which way to look. So they certainly, a lot of scientists in our community just presented last week at our conference on what they're learning in the lab, but they don't know what a patient, experiences on a day-to-day basis. What does bleeding look like? What does bruising look like? What other symptoms are they having? There's a lot they can learn, right, from what we're learning from you. And so we share these aggregated data with them. And then, putting together what we're learning with what they're learning in the lab, we can inform where we go next in the Data Hub. What are the next questions that are important to ask for the next phases of their research? And then one other point that's important in all of this is I might put over here the Food and Drug Administration here in the US. They're a regulatory body that sort of governs what medications are approved for use for any disease. And so it's really important. These registries, the Data Hub is a type of patient data registry, and they're used really to help develop treatments and medications that do need to be reviewed by organizations like that. And more and more, these organizations are turning to rare disease organizations like ours and looking at the data from registries to better understand what our patient experiences, and do these treatments that have been submitted to us for review, will they be effective? Are they important for this patient community? So it's really important for us to collect these data to inform that work as well. All right, so that is what the Data Hub is. Now, who is on the Data Hub team? It's actually quite a large team, and we built up, Katrina and I are leading it, but we built up a group of experts who can advise on the design of the work and ensure that we're thinking of everything. So we have a few MDs, medical doctors who see patients. We have an expert in variant classification who can help us sort of look at some variants that may be very rare, and understand whether that this person qualifies for the Data Hub. Look at somatic mutations, that sort of thing. We have a couple of genetic counselors who are experts on RUNX1, and so they review all the genetic test reports that are submitted for. They look at the variant and classification and make sure patients are eligible. And then we have a team of a few part-time people. We have an intern who's helped us translate documents into Spanish. We have a data coordinator you may have heard from if you're in the Data Hub. She helps to ensure that all questions are answered and that all responses are complete. And then we have a biostatistician. Yang is actually at Johns Hopkins, and he is with us part-time to run our data analyses in a rigorous manner. Okay, so who is in the Data Hub? We have 56 patients enrolled. Of those, 46 have submitted their genetic test reports. A handful don't qualify, and we still need more information for a couple of genetic test reports. But we do have 41 qualifying individuals across 32 individual families. And so today I will show you some data that some aggregated findings for those individuals and families, and I'm excited to share that with you today. Because 41 is a decent percentage of the 350 individuals that we do know of, we do feel like we can draw some conclusions now in terms of trends of what, so the findings that we present today, we do feel like could represent this sort of average experience of patients across that 350 patients in our community. We did have a sort of lofty goal of 160 by the end of the year. We reached 41 and feel good about that. We had hoped that for this presentation, we could show you some really dynamic analyses, perhaps look at like, do higher rates of eczema or higher rates of bleeding link with higher rates of blood cancer in families, things like that. That's really does require a greater number of individuals. But today we can show you some general patterns and some new findings that we think are representative of general experiences for our patient community. And of note, actually 58% of patients in the Data Hub are in the NIH study. So it's really nice to hear that so many patients are willing to participate in both. We recognize there's some redundancy in the questions, at least for this first pass, because we wanted to just generally understand patients' experiences. But and we promote the NIH study to every patient who comes by because we see such great value in the deep analyses that they do at the molecular level and the great care they provide to patients that we hear about in our community. But it's important to note that 42% might not necessarily join the NIH study, and that's okay too. There are reasons why patients don't join, and so we're really glad that we can learn from all patients who are willing. So in terms of what we're seeing, we have a nice range across age groups. We do hope to see over time that maybe these ranges might be better represented, and we'll get the sort of even a better distribution. But right now, the median age of participants in our Data Hub is 37, with the youngest being 2 years old and the oldest being 76. In terms of gender, we see a pretty nice balance, and we were really happy to see a greater sort of a bump up in males since our last report. We had a larger percentage of females, but now we have a pretty nice balance. I will be comparing, you'll see where I can, comparing some of these findings to All of Us, which is a very large population database. So it's a study also out of the NIH where they're trying to reach 1 million people in the US, adults in the US, and trying to ask questions about general health of the average individual in the US. And so it's amazing what's been collected. They actually have enrolled over 726,000 individuals in the US. Their goal is 1 million. But it's really nice because this data set is available for analyzing so that we can just give a little context to what we're finding so that you can see, okay, if the eczema rate is this among our RUNX1 patient group, what is it in sort of the general population? What is sort of normal out there? And so that's where I'll bring in some of those numbers. And so first, I'm just showing you here that just generally All of Us has a really nice distribution of adults. Again, it's just adults. And ours is not quite as nice, but hopefully as we gather more closer to this, as we gather more, we'll see a greater distribution of age that's very similar. But what's really nice to see next is that gender distribution is very similar. And so when we look at factors related to gender in the RUNX1 Data Hub and then compare it to All of Us, we think that it's a nice comparison. So that's that piece. Okay, so let's turn to what is the Data Hub teaching us about our community. This is really where we get excited to talk about like what are the results that we can bring back to you. Again, it's going to be anonymized and confidential. It always will be. But with 41 individuals, we feel like we can draw some conclusions about the general RUNX1 FPD patient community. So while I'm presenting these, I hope that you'll sort of put on your scientist hats and think about like, oh, that's interesting. What are what other questions these trends give you in your mind? What questions do you have about the patient community as I present these? And are these similar to your experiences or different? I would love to hear from you if you have a different experience and if there's something else we should ask about in the data hub that you're curious about. All right, so it has been a long diagnostic journey for most. As you can see, patients are diagnosed anywhere from 1 to 72 in this group. Just of note here, I have N equals 35. That means only 35 out of the 41 responded to this question for one reason or another. And so you'll see in each chart that I share with you, the N might be slightly different from 41 because we didn't require that patients answer every single question. You were allowed to skip some questions if you'd like. So going back to this, when were individuals diagnosed with RUNX1? So anywhere from the age of 1 to 72, and we see diagnosis across all sort of age deciles, and the median age for this group was 34 to get a RUNX1 diagnosis, but it really varies. What we do see is that there was a long time to diagnosis for half of patients, over 10 years, in fact, for half of patients. So this might not be a surprise to you. It wasn't a major surprise to me because I hear that from patients in our one-on-one conversations all the time. They sort of started very young, and it just took them a very long time to find the right doctor who just had a reason to test them for RUNX1, and then they found their diagnosis. Interestingly, like when I said earlier, I'd appreciate you putting on your scientific hat. We actually had one patient who did this. So in my last report, I believe this rate was high, of course, for time to diagnosis. But what this patient mentioned was like she was actually surprised that a number of people, 10 people, in fact, a quarter of these were diagnosed in less than a year. And she thought that was pretty quick. And that's a really good point. She wondered if perhaps those that were diagnosed in that very quick time frame were diagnosed because they either got a blood cancer diagnosis or someone in their family was diagnosed with a cancer. So that's a really good question. So next, I will start digging in, to like, okay, why were these 5 individuals diagnosed with RUNX1 FPD? Because we did ask that question, why were you tested for RUNX1 FPD? So it could be the case that all 10 of these were diagnosed or were tested because they had a family member or they themselves were diagnosed with a blood cancer. So those are the kinds of questions we'd love to hear from you that help us think through like how to dig into like even the data we have now, because it's so rich and there's so much we could sort of look into. So that'll be next. Love to hear from you if you have those kinds of questions too. So also ITP, many of you may have heard of this. ITP is immune thrombocytopenia purpura. It used to be referred to also as idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura. But basically 28% of our patient group was diagnosed with ITP in the past. And so what does that mean to us? That actually brings in the advocacy piece. So in terms of one of the goals of the RUNX1 research program is also to reduce that long time to diagnosis. We know that dealing with trying to find answers to to the reasons why you're having these issues with your platelets and bleeding and bruising is exhausting. We hear that from patients, and we also hear of instances where they've been treated with medication or a splenectomy that they should not have had their doctor known that they had RUNX1. So we really want to help shorten that amount of time to an accurate diagnosis. And one way we're doing that is through a medical education program where we are recruiting physicians who know RUNX1 well to speak to their peers in a webinar format and tell them about RUNX1 and help them think strategically about, when they have a patient in front of them, when to think of RUNX1 and other predispositions like ours, other predispositions to blood cancer like ours. And so one thing we're doing in 2024 is really extending that to classical hematology. And those are the hematologists who aren't necessarily seeing cancer patients, but are seeing patients that are having like, sort of funny blood or, issues with bleeding, these are doctors who diagnose patients with ITP. And so we feel that this is a confirmation that that is a good place for us to spend our time next year, raising awareness and educating physicians through that program. So bruising is a big issue. Again, we hear that a lot from patients in our community, and we have now numbers to back that up. We see that 90% of patients in our data hub deal with easy bruising, and that is no easy feat, because I hear of individuals who really struggle with that, explaining what is going on with their bruising, why they have bruises, and finding some embarrassment from that. So that's really a bummer to see. But we have numbers now. So thank you all for those of you who are sharing your experiences. Bleeding issues. So this one was a little surprising. So we talk about, we understand RUNX1 FPD biology is a platelet issue. So it causes bruising, it causes bleeding. But we asked about, have you had issues in the last year with persistent bleeding that continues for a long period of time after trauma, or difficulties getting bleeding to stop once it started? We actually expected, a greater than 48% of our, sorry, let me back up. 48% of our patients say yes, they have had these sorts of issues with persistent bleeding. But 43% say no, and 10% aren't sure. So we actually see that only like just under half really deal with persistent bleeding as an issue. So that was lower than we expected. And like I said before, if physicians and scientists are thinking about using persistent bleeding as a measure, as an endpoint in clinical trials, as a goal to reduce bleeding, that might be concerning if only 48% of patients are dealing with persistent bleeding. Would bruising be bruising would be hard to measure, but this is food for thought. This is very valuable information for us to be able to share with our scientific community as we think about clinical trial design. One question we had as we were looking at this persistent bleeding issue is whether, maybe we see that maybe this half is mostly women. Maybe women who are dealing with monthly menstrual cycles deal with persistent bleeding, and that's what's going on here. So we did look at gender, and so what we see here is that actually a greater proportion of men are in the maroon, the dark red color, greater proportion of men report that they've had bleeding issues than women. So 46% of women report having persistent bleeding issues, and 50% of men report having bleeding issues. So it's pretty similar, but we're not really seeing that it's all women who are having reporting persistent bleeding. So, admittedly, because our numbers are pretty low, we didn't dive down and look at women of childbearing age. So that'll be a next step as we have greater numbers to see if there's something going on there. But we'd love to hear from you. Is this different than you expected? Is this the same? Do you not really have issues with bleeding? Or is it, should we ask this question in a different way? We're asking about bleeding that won't stop once it's started. Do you think of your bleeding issues and challenges differently? Is it more of a sort of daily, sort of lighter problem for you? Would love to hear from you on that. Okay, nosebleeds. We see that 25% of our population have frequent nosebleeds. So, less, a quarter. And then similarly, about a quarter have ever had platelet transfusions or medication to slow bleeding. So maybe not a huge surprise given the persistent bleeding question, but relatively low. Only a quarter have had to have medication. So again, maybe persistent bleeding that requires treatments, not a major issue for our community, but I'd love to hear from you on whether that's consistent with your experience. So in terms of platelets, the majority of patients in our data hub report platelets that fall between 50 and 150,000 platelets per microliter of blood. So that's consistent. You know, we talk about RUNX1 FPD causing sort of mildly low platelets. We hear from patients that a lot of the doctors say that they have low, like mildly low, but not risky, not concerningly low. And we think maybe that's part of why patients are sort of not diagnosed quickly, because there's not this acute worry of something scary going on. They just sort of sit in that range. We talk about RUNX1 FPD also being due or causing a poor platelet function or dysfunctional platelets. And so this might seem kind of surprising that only 45% of patients report that, yes, they have poor functioning and they've gotten a diagnosis of platelet function dysfunction. But actually, you know what, one thing to point out is that right now, in terms of what's available commercially to doctors to test for platelet function or dysfunction, only those with at least 100,000 platelets per microliter of blood or more can be tested for their platelet function. So therefore, it's not really a surprise to us that like a 55% are either uncertain or have not had platelet function testing, because it might be the case that many of them sit under that 100,000 platelets per microliter, and therefore they just can't be tested. Okay, so in terms of anemia, we do hear from a lot of individuals that they struggle with anemia and they need to take iron on a regular basis to avoid it. So in terms of those who have been diagnosed with low hemoglobin or anemia, we see 32% of this group. And again, I wondered if we'd see it more among women who bleed every month. And actually, what do we see? We do see that a greater proportion of females compared to the proportion of males report being diagnosed with anemia. So, but again, these are still quite low, kind of lower rates than we expected. And so one thing we're thinking about doing is asking the question around chronic anemia. So perhaps you know, this question is about sort of, have you ever been diagnosed with anemia? But I think maybe, oh, one thing I should mention is that I did compare this to all of us. And so we see 32% of the RUNX1 population diagnosed with anemia. In all of us, 30% report anemia. So it's not that different from sort of the normal population rates of anemia. But again, that's where I'm thinking, well, maybe, you know, in the sort of regular non-RUNX1 population, we see anemia periodically diagnosed at 30%, but maybe it's the case in our community that we see this like consistent month-to-month diagnosis of it or month-to-month low hemoglobin. That means like consistent chronic anemia. So we might look at diving into that a little bit more, but again, love to hear from you, what you think. Okay, so let's look at bone marrow. So now we're going to dive into bone marrow biopsies and aspirations. So we, you know, there are different, you might know this, we hear from a lot of patients that they're not sure how often they should have their blood drawn to monitor for issues, how often they need to have a bone marrow biopsy. Do they need to have a bone marrow biopsy? Many parents wonder if they really need to put their children through that. Totally understandable. What we're seeing is that 70% of our population have had a bone marrow biopsy, and 30% have not. You know, we come from the mind, we speak with a lot of experts who monitor patients closely with RUNX1, and we are of the mind that at least having a baseline bone marrow biopsy is important so that physicians can kind of see what your cells look like at baseline. So if ever there's concern for elevated numbers in your blood, then maybe another bone marrow can be done, and then those can be compared to see if there's been any concerning change. But these are good conversations to have with your physician if you're not currently having a biopsy, and to make the right decision for yourselves. In terms of abnormalities, so once a bone marrow biopsy comes back, physician, when a physician, pathologist look closely, they might look for a few of these abnormalities. What I want you to take away from here is that we see that 48% these patients report that abnormalities have been found, one of these three types, but that 30%, 7 out of 23 is about 30%, are actually uncertain whether abnormalities have been found. And so again, that's where RUNX1 Research Program might come in. This is a nice educational opportunity we could help fill. Maybe we can help patients think about, okay, if you've had a bone marrow biopsy, maybe you should ask these following questions of your doctor so you can better understand the results of that biopsy. And one important point to make here is that we at RRP are excited to say that we have just recently started funding a genetic counselor and a doctor to lead developing clinical consensus guidelines with a lot of RUNX1 experts. And so in about hopefully a year and a half to 2, we will have some really defined guidance for physicians who are managing your care to provide recommendations in terms of how often to have a bone marrow biopsy, how often to have your blood checked, various other ways, considerations for your care, things to look at, things to do. So we're excited about that, and hopefully you'll find that very helpful for you and your care teams. Blood cancer. So we do know a lot of patients worry about the potential for blood cancer. We know that across reports from the literature, we see anywhere from 35 to 50% chance for RUNX1 patients to have a blood cancer. What we do see in our data hub right now are that 83% do not. Currently, individuals have not been diagnosed with a blood cancer, and 17% have. In terms of families, we see 31% of families, the 32 families that are in the database, 31% of them have had a history of blood cancer, at least one member with a blood cancer, and 69% have not. So these are, the 17 to 31 looks a little lower than the risk that we talk about for RUNX1 patients overall. But we do, when we compare it to all of us, we see that under 3% of individuals or their family members have been diagnosed with blood cancer. So it's really a lot lower than these two percentages. So, concerning. It's good. Thought it'd be important to pull that context because I don't see that often written. Okay, so what else did we look at beyond blood systems? We looked at a lot of things beyond the blood system, and that's because for numerous reasons, but we've started to hear from the NIH study, for example, that other systems besides the blood might be affected for RUNX1 patients, like the skin and the GI tract. Additionally, we hear in a lot of these one-on-one conversations and small group conversations in the private Facebook group that patients are curious about their joints, their muscles, all of these other things I talked about a little bit earlier. So I wanted to make sure today to dive into a few of these, but know that we asked about these large, areas of the body, and then we dug deeper into specifics. So we asked, have you had skin issues? And then after that, if they say yes to that question, we ask about eczema and psoriasis and other skin issues. And so I'm going to first really just focus on these higher level areas of concern, because as we dig deeper into those smaller numbers, we really feel like we need more representation from the community to know if those patterns are sort of representative of RUNX1 patients as a whole. But this is a starting point. I wanted to show you a few things, and happy to dive into this with you later. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me, or we can hop on the phone. So first of all, let's look at skin, like I mentioned. So we do see that 60% of patients report having some issues with the skin, and actually eczema was the most commonly reported at 43% of 40 patients report having issues with eczema. In terms of digestive system issues, we see 43% of patients reporting digestive system issues, with esophagus issues like reflux being the most common at 20%. Lungs and or breathing issues, we see 23% of patients dealing with that, and we see 23% of patients also dealing with immune systems. So in terms of lungs and breathing, some of the most common is unusual breathing patterns like sleep apnea. And then in terms of immune system issues, the common ones are immunodeficiency and recurrent infections. So some common concerns I wanted to present are, we hear about the flexible joints and connective tissue issues. We do see that 25% of patients report issues in these areas, with flexible joints being the most common at 15%. We also see 10% reporting curvature of the spine, like scoliosis. That's something that patients have reported and wondered about. And I did compare that to all of us. I found that just under 4% of individuals in all of us report having scoliosis, or kyphosis, which is like a different kind of curvature of the spine. Let's see, we see 20% report having heart and or blood vessel issues. 12% report muscle issues, and 25% report oral health issues. So these are interesting. Like, so maybe these 25% would be worth, even this 20% would be really worth digging into as we get greater numbers of participants. And I can hopefully in a year, we'll be able to talk about some of those very specific oral health issues, the specific heart issues, et cetera. Let's see, in terms of mental health. So unfortunately, we do see that 33% of our population report having some sort of mental health challenge. Anxiety is the most common at 18%. And for comparison, we see that in the general population of all of us, we see 12% experience anxiety. In terms of depression, actually 10% of our population report depressive symptoms, whereas in all of us, 16% report depression. So actually a lower percentage in our group. Again, very small numbers. We'll have to stay tuned. Now, this was surprising. We actually saw that 55% of patients report eyes or vision issues. You might think what I think. I was thinking, well, nearsightedness is very common, so maybe that's it. And it's true that 33% of these 40 experience or have been diagnosed as nearsighted. But actually in all of us, in the general population, we only see 8% of individuals being nearsighted. So this is pretty high. So Katrina and I are going to dig a little bit more. Katrina did remember some reports of some connection between eyes and RUNX1 functionally. And so we'll start to dig into that a bit more into the future and see what might be going on. Another kind of surprising result was that 33% of patients report ears and or hearing issues. So that's a potential signal. And so again, another area that we'll want to dig into as we have more patients involved. So that's a lot to digest, and happy to share any of these slides with you, talk with you through some of this. But I did want to cover a little bit about where we want to go next. So first, we would like to increase the numbers of people involved so that we can dig into some of these follow-up questions and understand linkages between some of these symptoms and rates of blood cancer and other health outcomes. Would love to hear from you if there's ways that we can make it easier to participate. We have just recently added a $50 gift card to offset patients' time. We recognize it takes time to do all of this when everyone has busy lives and other things going on. So we wanted to make sure that we honor patients' time with a $50 gift card. Is there anything else we can do to make participation more appealing? Please let us know. Yearly follow-up. So we did ask about a lot of things in terms of patient health and family health. And so we won't ask everything again, but in terms of things that might change over time, we will ask some follow-up questions yearly just to look for change. Spanish language, I think I mentioned that earlier. We have an intern who helped us translate everything into Spanish. So in the next year, we're going to be offering more medical education to Spanish speaking and Spanish serving physicians. And so alongside that, we're excited to be able to offer the patient data hub as a way those patients can participate and contribute and learn. We are looking at adding additional questions. And so we want to check in on pain. We hear a lot about patients struggling with pain, fatigue. We understand that's a big challenge for patients. And I'm sure there are other areas that like I said, I have a long list of other symptoms to dive into that we're going to consider for next year. Additionally, treatment preferences are important. This was a big goal of this database, is to really ask patients about their preferences in terms of taking medication or not taking medication. What would they be willing to take to reduce their cancer risk or reduce their symptoms that they report? And in what format would you prefer it? Would you be open to going to a clinic and having an infusion? Or do you really think that that's unrealistic and a pill form medication at home is really the only option that would be comfortable for you? Lots of questions like that. We're going to spend some time developing that part of the data hub, but we want to get into that soon because, as you might know, clinical trials are beginning to kick off, and we really want to make sure we equip scientists with patients' preferences as they begin to design those. And I'll leave that there. Lots to learn. Lots I'm excited about. And finally, what questions do you have? Like I said, we have a long list of additional questions that patients have brought up that we'd like to include in our sometime next year. We again are realistic. We don't want to overwhelm participants in the data hub, but there's so much to learn about RUNX1, and we'd love to hear from you what other questions you have. And we'll actually reach out early next year to have a more formal meeting to get your perspectives and your questions included and prioritized as part of our next steps. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so next I just wanted to share a little bit about how to join. It's really simple. You just you'll find on our website, Patient Data Hub page, and there's a lot of information there to answer any questions you might have, but simply click sign up when you're ready, and you will create a REDCap Cloud account. That's the form our data hub is built on. And then you'll have a chance to read through the study details and what you're signing up for, and understand your rights to get out of the data hub at any point, all of that. And then once you finish that and consent, you will be given several forms to fill out, a place to upload your genetic test report. If you have any questions at all, you can reach out to me or Lauren Bartlett by email or by phone. Happy to talk to you through any of this. And again, when you submit your test report, genetic test report, or a letter from your physician, we can confirm you qualify and you complete your data entry. We will send you a $50 gift card. You actually have many vendors you can choose from, even international vendors you can choose from to receive that gift card in. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to all the patients who have taken time to participate and share their experiences with us. We really appreciate that, and we don't take it lightly. Yeah, so please, if you're watching this recording, please send me questions later, any comments, anything that you have, any feedback you have. We really appreciate it. Thanks.